There stands a rock. Sammy's working that back there in case y'all were wondering. There stands a rock. No. There stands a rock on shores of time that rears to heaven its head sublime. That rock is cleft, and they are blessed who find within the cleft a rest. Some build their hopes on the ever-drifting sand, some on their fame or their treasure or their land. Mine's on the rock that forever shall stand, Jesus, the rock of ages. That rock's across, its arms outspread, celestial glory makes its head to its face. My all I bring, and to the cross of ages cling. Some build their hopes on the ever-drifting sand, some on their fame or their treasure or their land. Mine's on the rock that forever shall stand, Jesus, the rock of ages. That rock's a tower whose lofty height, illumined with heaven's unclouded light, those like gates beneath the dome, where saints find rest with Christ at home. Some build their hopes on the ever-drifting sand, some on their fame or their treasure or their land. Mine's on the rock that forever shall stand, Jesus, the rock of ages. Now dismiss to our classes.
Finish up a few things in chapter 25 here from that account, and then we're going to get right on into Numbers 26 and 27. We're about to come to a really important part, and it's maybe hard to see that when you look at Numbers 26, because when you first look at it, there's just a lot of names. But of course, what's happening in chapter 26 that happened at the very beginning of Numbers as well? Census. And we'll talk more about that and why that's significant as we move on into chapter 27. So what happened in chapter 25? You can't forget this story. Anybody remember? What did you say? Well, you had, in 22 through 24, you had Balaam and Balak and the talking donkey and all of that. Yes, so remember, and without going into everything that we studied about Balaam and Balak, which was interesting, he gives 4 oracles. What did Balak want Balaam to do? curse Israel, but what does he end up doing? Blessing Israel. Okay. And as far as who Balaam is, kind of a well-known pagan seer, basically. But he was well-known. We know that both extra-biblically and biblically. So then, God's not going to curse them, obviously, and even says, I don't see any trouble in Israel to cause me to want to curse them. And Balak is fearful, of course, but he sees Israel and how powerful they look and what they've been doing and these other victories that we've talked a lot about. But then when we come to chapter 25, while God has not been cursing Israel, when you come to chapter 25, what does Israel do again? They become unfaithful again. And so is there anybody behind that kind of thought maybe we can, if we can't really seduce God to get him to curse Israel, but maybe we can seduce Israel to get them to be disloyal to God? Who was kind of behind that? Balaam. You find that out later in chapter 31 that Balaam was actually involved in that. And one of the interesting things is when you come to Revelation, we've read that verse several times, it actually mentions that and links what Balaam did here with the sexual immorality and the idolatry, and of course made an application to those who were living in the first century about be careful about the doctrine of Balaam. And it mentions sexual immorality and idolatry. Okay, so before we get on into chapter 26, and that's going to be significant in 27, we'll talk more about that in a minute. I want to finish up as far as application. So we see that. So Phinehas, who was Phinehas? Son of Eleazar, grandson of Aaron. Right. So who's high priest now? Yeah, Eleazar. Remember Aaron, because of his rebellion to God and that kind of thing, he and Moses. Now Moses is still alive at this point, but he goes up on the mount and he's stripped of his garments and he's going to be with his fathers. You might say he dies. So Miriam's gone, Aaron's gone from that first generation as far as leadership. Moses is still here. Eleazar, being the son of Aaron, then is going to serve as high priest, is appointed to that. And so, as we're thinking about this application for us, Phinehas, and we talked about Phinehas comes in and he sees this immorality going on, and there's this plague of judgment that comes on Israel. But there is a Jewish man that brings an idolatrous pagan woman into his tent around his family. They're being sexually immoral, and while they're in the process of doing that, what does Phinehas do? Yeah, kills them. And how does God respond to that? Which might surprise some people. Yeah, he certainly doesn't censor him. He says that's exactly the right thing. Now you have to, and we talked about this last time, if you just read that part, you have to get the context. So if you look at the context, there's people dying all over the place, and this man is brazen enough just to there's no fear of God in him at all for what's happening. So you have your fellow Israelites who are dying all around you, and then you just bring this woman right in, not even worried about it, and you're going to be sexually immoral. And so a lot more people would have died. The Bible actually says that there's a sense in which what Phinehas did not only showed the jealousy of God and zeal of God and the holiness of God, but actually served as an atonement. So it checked the plague. It stopped that. It satisfied God. And if that hadn't happened, who knows, what else might have happened in judgment. Okay. So what application do we have? I mentioned Revelation. Let's look at Revelation, and then I want to point out something to you about idolatry. And I know we've seen this several times, but we want to look at it again. Look at Revelation chapter 2, and we're going to look at several New Testament passages. And you see this a lot in the New Testament because of Gentiles coming out of idolatry, Gentiles coming out of paganism and becoming children of God and becoming Christians and what they had to deal with. And the Jewish background, as far as what they end up dealing with in the first century, is distinct from what the Gentiles tended to deal with. But there had been a time, the Jews tended to forget this, there had been a time when the Jewish people struggled with this, as we're reading in the book of Numbers. So it's not like they had never given in to the seduction of idolatry, or that they had never given in to the seduction of sexual immorality. We can see that right here in Numbers chapter 25. So when you look at Revelation chapter 2, in these discussions with the 7 churches of Asia, if you look at Revelation and you look at chapters 2 and 3, can you guys help me with finding, there it is, verse 14. Revelation 2, he mentions the one who has the two-edged sword says this, I know where you dwell, verse 13, where Satan's throne is. So they were where there was the influence of Satan all around him. And you hold fast my name and did not deny my faith, even in the days of Antipas, my witness, my faithful one, who was killed among you where Satan dwells. But I have a few things against you, because you have there some who hold the teaching of who? Balaam, who kept teaching Balak to put a stumbling block before the sons of Israel, to eat things sacrificed to idols, and to commit acts of sexual immorality or fornication. Now, to understand why he says that, you have to look at Numbers chapter 25. And so it didn't stop where you would think it would stop. There in Numbers, after the whole, Balaam and Balak and the blessing of Israel, Balaam's still working on the backside. Now he goes on to talk about the doctrine of the Nicolaitans. But let's think about this. When he says, some of you here hold to the teaching of Balaam when he was encouraging sexual immorality and eating with idols, why would he say that to them? That's right, something very similar. So here you are, if you're living in Rome, you're living in the first century, what was going on? Well, you had people in local churches who had the idea that you could compromise. And you have to realize in the first century, especially if you're living in Rome, some of these trade guilds, basically, if you were going to make a living and provide for your family, you're supposed to be part of that. There were idolatrous practices going on. In order to be able to provide for your family, you wanted to, be a part of that. And he's saying no. And people were saying, well, yeah, you can just you can do that and still be a Christian. He says, no, that's the doctrine of Balaam. So compromise toward moral standards. Now think about it in our time. Compromise toward moral standards while you still claim you believe in Jesus, but you're actually following the doctrine of Balaam. You're involved in really paganistic, idolatrous, materialistic, fleshly sins, and somehow that's still going to be acceptable to God. So the first century. Now, what's interesting, I won't forget you, Alan. One of the interesting things about the Jews, their problems in the first century when Jesus comes and the apostles come tend to be not understanding, the nature of salvation, Christ providing salvation to the Gentiles, etc. One thing God did get out of them, generally, was idolatry. You don't see a lot of idolatry from the Jews in the first century. I'm sure you could find some faction of that, but that doesn't tend to be their problem. But it took a lot of captivities to get that out of them. You have to remember, there was an Assyrian captivity, there was a Babylonian captivity. There were all these things. So did they struggle with hypocrisy? Yeah. Did they struggle with just going through the motions? Yeah. Did they have sins that caused them not to see who Jesus was? Yes, all of that's true. But when you see so much emphasis, and we're going to look at a few passages in the first century that sounds like you're dealing with idolatry and sexual immorality, who probably is that focused on the most? Gentiles coming out of that. Okay, we'll come back to that in just a minute. So what we're learning in Numbers, and this is the important thing, I know I keep saying this, but what we learn in Numbers is not just interesting history, because we have New Testament writers pulling on Numbers. I mean, retelling the story or alluding to the story. And so it's important for us to know these stories so that when I read about the doctrine of Balaam, I know generally what we're talking about. You have it in 1 Corinthians 10, you have it in Hebrews 3 and 4, you have it in the book of Revelation. So, the book of Numbers, as all books of the Bible do, matter. Go ahead, Alan. Yeah. Yeah. That's right. It's seems to me it's almost like giving some kind of strategic instruction on how to do this. Yeah. And it makes you wonder, would Balak have, it doesn't seem like he would he have thought of doing this had it not been for Balaam? It doesn't seem like that would have happened, because he seems like he's at a loss at this point, and then Balaam comes back and teaches him. So that's what false teachers do. They, even before some people realize it, they get you to a place, maybe before you even realize it, but it's based on the flesh and error. That's a good point. Okay, let's look at some New Testament passages. Now, does anybody have an idea, why is it idolatry and sexual immorality might be so linked together in Scripture? Old Testament and New Testament. This isn't a trick question, really. So, go ahead, Alan. Right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. And so to go to that point from, and this is always how Satan deceives us, it seems, by appealing to the flesh in some way. But if you think about it, if you're designing your own God, and there's plenty of prophets that will mock that, where was he? Was he on vacation? Did he go on a long trip? Is he asleep? Whatever. But if you're creating and crafting and you're living in the flesh, you're not thinking about denying yourself, and I can make the God say whatever I want the God to say, and I'm driven by my own desires, then I just transfer that to the God and say, well, he's telling me this is the worship. And so, you go to the city of Corinth, and you have in Corinth a temple, and the priestesses are basically temple prostitutes. And that's how idolatry works. There's something else, though, and this goes more to what Alan was saying, I think. If you think about, once you deny the true and living God, in some way, you're being driven by what you want, by what you desire, okay? And that can come in a lot of different forms. Well, if this is one of the most basic temptations and seductions throughout time, to get us to think through the flesh rather than to think in the Spirit, it really shouldn't be that surprising that. So if you've lived that way, you've been involved in pagan idolatry, your parents were, your grandparents were, your whole culture was, and now think about what a shift that is if you're a first century Gentile Christian. We've talked a lot about the Jews and what they're coming out of, but let's talk about if you're a Gentile Christian. You just now have come to understand the true and living God. Okay? Just that all by itself, coming out of polytheism and all these many gods, and most of these gods function based on human desires. Okay? So now you have this transcendent, spiritual, God is the Spirit, God. You've come to believe that Jesus Christ came and died for you. Just the idea of God dying for you would be something that is shocking if you have a Gentile background. And then not only that, any, pre-Gnostic notions of, somehow I can be involved in certain things with my flesh and it has no impact on my spirit, that's out the window. And we're going to read some passages where you go, okay, he's saying, look, you don't get to separate those. You don't get to separate those. We've even had some teachings in recent modern times that were kind of like, what happens with the body doesn't impact the soul. But really, that's Gnostic more than anything. That's pagan. So you've come to believe in the resurrection. That's a whole new idea. So what I'm saying is, if you're a Gentile that's coming out of all of that and now you believe the truth, you've had to jump through a lot of hoops here. You talk about transformation. And now you're worshiping with Jews that are wondering, okay, have they really done that? So let's look at some passages and then we'll come back to Numbers. But look at, for instance, we know Romans 1:18 through 32. Let's just hit some highlights there. Romans chapter 1. Now, after Romans 1, Paul seems to address the Jews, and then in Romans 3 says all men have sinned. But in Romans 1, you see, I think he is describing the Gentile apostasy, even though it's interesting because a lot of this language, if you go back to Exodus and Numbers, you go, well, wait a minute, the Jews did that too. But notice with me, let's read in Romans 1 as he talks about those who had professed themselves to be wise, they became fools, they're without excuse because of this natural revelation. But look there, let's read verses 23, and let's just come down through verse 27. And again, what we were just talking about, the problem with idolatry. And as we read this, let me say this. I'm sure you can find some people in our society that actually worship graven images, but somebody might think, well, I'm not going to be worshiping a graven image. But we could buy in to crafting a view of God, thinking that's the God of the Bible, that doesn't fit with what the Bible says about him. And we make him into a different God. Well, that's basically modern day idolatry. And it leads to the same places. So let's read Romans chapter 1 and verses 23 through 27. Might be go. That sounds like a description of modern day society, doesn't it? But it's based on a denial of who God really is. And it always goes that way in some form or fashion. Let's look at 1 Corinthians 6. Now, think about Romans. So if you think about the church at Rome, you certainly had a Jewish composite, but you had a pretty major Gentile composite here too. We've talked when we studied Romans, but you remember initially when Claudius had the Jews leave Rome, what would the church of Rome been made up of? Gentiles. Almost exclusively. And then, actually it was Nero that did that. Claudius lets them come back, and now you have Jew, Gentile together. But still you have a big composite of Gentile Christians. So you can see why you would bring that up. Come to 1 Corinthians chapter 6. Again, the church at Corinth, you're talking about a very Gentile city in many ways. But let's look at 1 Corinthians 6. And when you read this, he says, listen, if you believe in the resurrection, now if you've gotten to the point where you believe in the resurrection of Jesus and you believe in a future resurrection, how would belief in a future resurrection, this is Paul's point, how would that impact your view of your own morality, sexual morality, and otherwise? Now, this is Paul's point, so let's think through it. Why would Paul, when he's talking about moral purity, bring up our future resurrection? How are they connected? We're going to be judged. Certainly, we're going to be judged for what we do with the body. That's right. What does it show us about God's attitude toward the body? Okay, he wants us to keep it pure. He cares about it. So if you're a Gentile who's coming out of paganism, what was your view of a future resurrection? There was not one. Okay. In fact, they saw the body as like a prison of the soul. And so their idea, you remember in Acts 17 when Paul starts talking about the resurrection of Christ, what did they do? They mocked. Now, there were a few who obeyed, but for them, just talking about the idea of a body dying and then having resurrection was something they couldn't hardly get their mind wrapped around. They didn't believe in resurrection of any kind. They believed the spirit would go to the spiritual realm. Now, my point to say that is to try to get us here. Our belief as Christians in the future resurrection is just not a end-of-time doctrine. It impacts us now. In fact, in 1 Corinthians 15, when the Apostle Paul talks about the future resurrection, right in the middle of that, he talks about how we conduct ourselves and being sober-minded and being moral. Look at 1 Corinthians 6. Get what Paul's doing here. He says in verse 13, food is for the stomach and stomach is for food, but God will do away with both of them. Yet the body is not for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord is for the body. Now God has not only raised the Lord, but will also raise us up through his power. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ? Now get what he's saying. If you're connected to Christ, if you have a relationship with Christ, he cares what you do with your body. So this notion that your spirit's fine, but you can commit all the sin you want to with your body, and it has no bearing on it. He says, that's not how this is going to work. He goes on to say, shall I then, so even God cares about my body. So when I obey the gospel, I give God all of me, not just some of him. He says, shall I then take away the members of Christ and make them members of a prostitute? May it never be. He's talking about sexual immorality in the context. And he's saying if all of me belongs to God, but I go and I involve myself in these fleshly sins, which of course he's going to go on to say impacts my spirit and my body. But his point is that that's spiritual adultery. So it is physically, it's sexual immorality, but it's also spiritual adultery. He says, may it never be. In fact, the language of, it doesn't really get this complete. It's almost as if we're dismembering Christ. It's a very violent kind of thing that's happening. Then notice verse 16, or do you not know that the one who joins himself to a prostitute is one body with her, for he says the two shall become one flesh. I think that might be the only time that phrase, do you know where that phrase is from? The two shall become one flesh? Genesis, creation, actually marriage. In Ephesians 5 and in Matthew 19, when that is referenced, it's in the sense of what marriage is to be. But here he says, but if you're acting like you should be acting, for instance, with your wife or husband in marriage and the sanctity of marriage with a prostitute, then look at what you're really doing. Verse 17, but the one who joins himself to the Lord is one spirit with him. Now look at verse 18. Now you see what he's doing. Flee sexual immorality. Every other sin that a man commits is outside the body, but the sexually immoral man sins against his own body. He goes on to say we're to glorify God in our body in verse 20. Our body is the temple of the Holy Spirit. So my point to you is, when we see Numbers and we see chapter 25, we come to the New Testament, that teaching is very important. And we won't read it, but 1 Thessalonians 4, 13 through 17 is very similar. It talks about our body being a vessel of sanctification, and God didn't create our bodies to be used for defilement and immorality. And the fact that he's going to raise our bodies from the dead indicates that our body is not just a temporary residence we have. Now, our body as it is now will have to be changed. It'll be changed. So it won't be like this, but it will be changed, and I will have a body. And it's not that, I think sometimes we don't think of resurrection. It's almost like a recreation. No, this body will be changed, is what Philippians 3 says, and it will be fashioned like Jesus' body. So the principles that we see in Numbers with Israel, yeah, God's not maybe having Phinehas throw spears through people, but has his attitude toward the need for his people to be holy really changed? I don't think so. Not at all. So let's go back to Numbers 26. Now, as I mentioned to you, this is significant, and we will talk about that. So when you look at this, as far as the structure of Numbers, this is a major shift. And we're going to talk a little bit about it. And there's 2 or 3 reasons maybe why this is important. But at the very beginning of Numbers, we talked about this. There's a major shift, it seems to me, between, now you see it alluded to maybe at chapter 20, but really you have 1 to 25, and then you hit 26 through 36. So let's talk about some of the reasons why the census, either census, but we'll go with the one in chapter 26, occurred. I mean, why does this matter? Because a lot of times when you say census to me, I start thinking of numbers and names, and that's about it. So why does this matter? Okay, so, and remember at the beginning of Numbers, the census was important to prepare for battle. They're going to go to battle again. Okay, to go with that, what else? Remember, they're close to the promised land too. What else do we learn here? What'd you say? That's right. The second thing, and we'll talk about why this matters in just a minute, but as Daryl mentioned, you've got preparing for battle, but also remember the land promises, the allotments based on tribe and the father's name and all of that. God had promised that to them. Now, were the Levites part of the initial census? No. Was there a census for Levites? Yes. The Levites would be given, cities, but not land. They received their benefit from their service from the people. Okay. So I say all of that to say, you hear that and you go, okay, Bruce, what am I supposed to take with me from that? So let's think about this. There's one more thing that's important here as to why they had to have another census. Alan. That's a good point. Right. Okay, now we got 4 things. Okay, that's right. So you have the warfare prepared, because as far as who's in that census, they're counting men that are 20 years old and up. So that can go to battle. All right, and they need to know that. Secondly, you have the proportionate of giving the land. Keeping that connection, the community connection. But there's something else. Why would you have to have a second census? Right, that's it. So part of the reason this shift is happening is that first generation, with the exceptions of who? Joshua and Caleb. They've died. Why aren't they getting to go into the promised land? Sin, rebellious sin. And we'll talk about even Moses. Will Moses get to go into the promised land? No. He'll get to see it in a beautiful and powerful way, but no. Who will take over leadership? Joshua. That's right. And God tells Joshua in Joshua 1, if you don't turn to the right or to the left, I'll be with you like I was with Moses. Okay. So when I look at all of this, and this is what I want us to do as we're thinking about, because this is where you can kind of get, when you see this kind of stuff, you kind of go, that's all interesting, but what does that mean for me? There's something about God that's really, really important throughout Numbers. And we see it right here. When they count up Israel, while there are some tribes that are less, some significantly, and others are more, at the end of the day, There's just not a major difference between the numbers of the first census and the numbers of the second census. So what that shows me is that, and what it was showing Israel, is you're not weak. God has blessed you. God is still with you. You're just as strong as ever, if not more so. Okay, so that's number one. But all of this tells us, whether you look at the land, or you look at being prepared for battle, or you look at their community connection, whatever you look at, with all of the losses, think about all the death that has happened. I mean, they've had a lot of people die because of sin and die because of rebellion. And this has been a long journey. And there was short distance, but it's been a long journey because they end up walking in circles because of this rebellion. And so here you are. I can see where you go, man, that first generation has died. What's going to happen to us? Now, they've had some victories, but remember, they've just got caught up in this sexual immorality all over again. And so it could cause you to think it's going to happen all over again, just like it did before. All of these things we're talking about with this census should say, look, God is with you, no matter how difficult things have been. And this second generation, is God going to lead his people into the promised land? Yes. Is he going to take that first generation into the promised land? No, but he's still true to his promise. He's taken that second generation in. He will be with you. And here's the thing I want us to get. You don't have to memorize all the names and numbers and all that. Just know, God is faithful. And just as he was faithful to them, he's faithful to us. And even when things are difficult, even when we're disappointed in ourselves, even when we're disappointed maybe in those close to us, maybe our own brethren, just remember, God is still with us, and God will still bless us. And so when you look at chapter 26, go back. That first generation in the first 10 or so chapters was very faithful, but remember, they get caught up in rebellion and sin. But now we're into this second major section, and we've covered most of this. Let me move on here just a little bit. And I mentioned in your notes, so we won't go through all this, some tribes had significant decrease. Some had significant increase. Most of them were pretty close to the same. But what that shows is that God is absolutely faithful. Now, in all this census, I want to show you just a couple of things. Look at Numbers chapter 26. And I want you to notice he's going through these names, but he mentions a few things. And when he mentions people, there's certain events that stand out. So look at verse 61. He says, verse 60, to Aaron were born Nadab and Abihu, Eleazar and Ithamar. But Nadab and Abihu, so here Eleazar is serving as high priest, but what does he say about Nadab and Abihu? Yeah. What'd you say, dear? They died. Yeah, they died. They died out of rebellion to God. Then you come down to verse 64, but among these there was not a man of who was numbered by Moses and Aaron the priest, who numbered the sons of Israel in the wilderness of Sinai. For the Lord had said of them, they shall surely die in the wilderness. That's that first generation. And not a man was left of them except Caleb the son of Jephunneh and Joshua the son of Nun. Why would let me ask you this. Why does he mention Nadab? And why does he have to tell us what happened to Nadab and Abihu? Lesson. So as you're going through this section, God's faithfulness we talked about. It's a warning. And it's an encouragement. It's both. First of all, he brings up Nadab and Abihu, and as he's just going through that list, he says, remember what happened to Nadab and Abihu. You don't want to follow in their footsteps. There's a reason for those lessons. We can follow in those footsteps. We can offer strange fire to God. We can rebel against the Lord and be irreverent and that kind of thing. So he says, make sure you don't do that. But then who does he mention toward the end of this census? Moses. He mentions Joshua and Caleb. Moses, of course, is going to end up dying, but those who survive. Joshua and Caleb, though, is an encouragement. Nadab and Abihu is a warning in this census. Don't be like that. But Joshua and Caleb, he's saying, follow in their footsteps. They were faithful. They believed. They trusted, even when most didn't trust at all. They trusted. And so when we look at this, yeah, it could get monotonous, but what I want us to see is even in chapter 26, we want to follow after Joshua and Caleb. We don't want to follow after Nadab and Abihu, and I think that's the point. Now, before we stop, if you would read chapter 27. Chapter 27 is an interesting chapter, but it's also significant. Let me just mention a couple of things to you about the faithfulness of God. So there's going to be some daughters of a man, a Jewish man. He doesn't have any sons. This inheritance is being given out. And they come to Moses and they're sad. And it's like, is our father's name? I mean, and they even say he sinned in the wilderness, but he didn't go with Korah. He wasn't in that full rebellion. And interestingly, Moses doesn't know, so he goes to God about this. And God's going to make provisions for the family of these women. And he says what they say is right. And he's going to take care of that. But now here's the part I also want you to see. And it's a sad scene to me in many ways. But God is going to talk to Moses about going ahead and appointing Joshua. And he's going to take Moses up and he's going to be able to see Canaan. And it doesn't mean he doesn't love Moses, but there's consequences for that previous action that took place, and we'll talk about it. But that will be important, obviously, because you're going to have Joshua being appointed. Now, Moses it's going to be a little bit. So he's still going to work with God's people, but he knows the status. So before we end, go ahead. Yeah. To count. I personally think it was for them to know. It was encouragement for them. What do you think? Yeah. Right, our responsibility to reciprocate, be a part. I do think them counting, there was some encouragement in seeing how many they had. It's much like when they sent the spies, we find out in Deuteronomy, that was for them. I mean, God knew what was over there in Canaan. So I think you're right. So we'll stop there. Thank you, guys.